Glowing auras and black money. In the $600 billion annual Defense Department budgets, the $22 million spent on Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program was almost impossible to find, which is how the Pentagon wanted it. For years, the program investigated reports of unidentified flying objects, according to Defense Department officials, interviews with program participants, and records obtained by the New York Times. It was run by a military intelligence official, Luis Elizondo, on the fifth floor of the Pentagon C ring, deep within the building's maze. The Defense Department has never before acknowledged the existence of the program, which it says was shut down in 2012. But its backers say that while the Pentagon ended funding for the effort at the time, the program remains in existence. For the past 5 years, they say, officials with the program have continued to investigate episodes brought to them by service members while also carrying out their other Defense Department duties. The shadowy program, parts of remain classified, began in 2007. Initially, it was largely funded at the request of Harry Reid, the Nevada Democrat who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time and who has long had an interest in space phenomenon. Most of the money went to an aerospace research company run by billionaire entrepreneur and longtime friend of Mr. Reid, Robert Bigelow, who is currently working with NASA to produce expandable craft for humans to use in space. On CBS's 60 Minutes in May, Mr. Bigelow said he was absolutely convinced that aliens exist and that the UFOs have visited Earth. Working with Mr. Bigelow, Las Vegas-based company, the program produced documents that described sightings of aircraft that seemed to move at very high velocities with no visible signs of propulsion or that hovered with no apparent means of lift. Officials with the program have also studied videos of encounters between unknown objects and American military aircraft, including one released in August of a whitish oval object about the size of a commercial plane chased by two Navy F-18 fighter jets from the aircraft Nimitz off the coast of San Diego in 2004. Mr. Reid, who retired from Congress this year, said that he was proud of the program. "I'm not embarrassed or ashamed or sorry. I got this thing going," Mr. Reid said in a recent interview in Nevada. "I think it's one of the good things I did in my congressional service. I've done something that no one has done before." Two other former senators and top members of Defense Spending Subcommittee, Ted Stevens and Alaska Republican Daniel K. Inuit, a Hawaii Democrat, also supported the program. Mr. Stevens died in 2010 and Mr. Inuit in 2012. While not addressing the merits of the program, Sarah Seeger, an astrophysicist at MIT, cautioned that not knowing the origin of an object does not mean that it is from another planet or galaxy. When people claim to observe truly unusual phenomenon, sometimes it's worth investigating seriously, she said, but she added, what people sometimes don't get about science is that we often have phenomena that remain unexplained. James Orberg, a former NASA Space Shuttle engineer and author of 10 books on spaceflight who often debunks UFO sightings, was doubtful there are plenty of prosaic events and human perceptual traits that can account for these stories. Mr. Orberg said, lots of people are active in the air and don't want others to know about it. They are happy to lurk unrecognized in the noise or even to stir up as camouflage. Still, Mr. Orberg said that he welcomed research and there could well be a pearl there. He said, in response to questions from the Times, Pentagon officials this month acknowledged the existence of the program, which began as part of a defense intelligence agency. Officials insisted that the effort had ended after 5 years in 2012. It was determined that there was other higher priority issues that merited funding, and it was best interest of the DoD to make a change, a Pentagon spokesman, Thomas Croson, said in an email referring to the Department of Defense. But Mr. Elizondo said that the only thing that ended was the effort's government funding, which dried up in 2012. From then on, Mr. Elizondo said in an interview, he worked with officials from Navy and the CIA. He continued to work out of his Pentagon office until this past October, when he resigned to protest what he characterized as excessive secrecy and internal opposition. Why aren't we spending more time and effort on this issue? Mr. Elizondo wrote in a resignation letter to Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Mr. Elizondo said that the effort continued and that he had a successor whom he declined to name. UFOs have been reportedly investigated over the decades in the United States, including by American military. In 1947, the Air Force began a series of studies that investigated more than 12,000 claimed UFO sightings before it was officially ended in 1969. The project, which included a study codenamed Project Blue Book, started in 1952, concluded that most sightings involved stars, clouds, conventional aircraft, or spy planes, although 701 remain unexplained. Robert Siemens Jr., said Secretary of the Air Force at the time, said in a memorandum announcing the end of the Project Blue Book that it no longer can be justified either on ground or national security or in the interest of science. Mr. Reed said his interest in UFOs came from Mr. Bigelow in 2007. Mr. Reed said in an interview, Mr. Bigelow told him that an official with the Defense Intelligence Agency had approached him wanting to visit Mr. Bigelow's ranch in Utah, where he conducted research. Mr. Reed said that he met with the agency officials shortly after his meeting with Robert Bigelow and learned that they wanted to start a research program on UFOs. Mr. Reed then summoned Mr. Stevens and Mr. Inouye to a secure room in the Capitol. I talked to John Glenn, a number of years before, Mr. Reed said, referring to the astronaut, former senator from Ohio, who died in 2016. Mr. Glenn, Mr. Reed had told him that he thought that the federal government should be looking seriously into UFOs and should be talking to military service members, particularly pilots who reported seeing aircraft they could not identify or explain. The sightings were not often reported up the military's chain of command, Mr. Reed said, because service members were afraid they would be laughed at or stigmatized. The meeting with Mr. Stevens and Mr. Inouye, Mr. Reed said, was one of the easiest meetings I ever had. He added, Ted Stevens said, I had been waiting to do this since I was in the Air Force. The Alaska Senator had been a pilot in the Army's Air Force flying transport missions over China during World War II. During the meeting, Mr. Reed said Mr. Stevens recounted being tailed by a strange aircraft with no known origin, which he said had followed his plane for miles. None of the three senators wanted public debate on the Senate floor about the funding for the program, Mr. Reed said. This was so-called black money. He said Mr. Stevens knows about it, anyone knows about it, but that was it, and that's how we wanted it. Mr. Reed was referring to the Pentagon budget for classified programs. Contracts obtained by the Times show a congressional appropriation of just under $22 million beginning in late 2008 through 2011. The money was used for management of the program, research, and assessments of threats posed by these objects. The funding went to Mr. Bigelow's company, Bigelow Aerospace, which hired subcontractors and solicited research for the program. Under Mr. Bigelow's direction, the company modified buildings in Las Vegas for the storage of metal alloys and other materials that Mr. Elizondo and program contractors said had been recovered from unidentified aerial phenomenon. Researchers also studied people who said they had experienced physical effects from encounters with the objects and examined them for any physiological changes. In addition, researchers spoke to military service members who had reported sightings of strange craft. We're sort of in the position of what would happen if you gave Leonardo da Vinci a garage door opener, said Harold Putoff, an engineer who has conducted research on extrasensory perception for the CIA and later worked as a contractor for the program. First of all, he tried to figure out what is this plastic stuff. He wouldn't know anything about the electromagnetic signals involved or its function. The program collected video and audio recordings of reported UFO incidents, including footage from Navy F-18 Super Hornets showing an aircraft surrounded by some kind of glowing aura traveling at high speeds and rotating as it moves. The Navy pilots can be heard trying to understand what they are seeing. There's a whole fleet of them, one exclaims. Defense officials declined to release the location and date of the incident. Internationally, we are most backward country in the world on this issue, Mr. Bigelow said in an interview. Our scientists are scared of being ostracized, and our media is scared of the stigma. China and Russia are much more open and work on this with huge organizations within their countries. Smaller countries like Belgium, France, England, South America, countries like Chile are more open to, and they are protective and willing to discuss the topic rather than being held back by juvenile taboo. In 2009, Mr. Reed decided the program had made such extraordinary discoveries that he argued for a heightened security to protect it. Much progress has been made with the identification of several highly sensitive, unconventional aerospace-related findings, Mr. Reed said in a letter to William Lynn III, a deputy defense secretary at the time, requesting that it be designated a restricted special access program limited to a few listed officials. In 2009, the Pentagon briefing summary of the program reported by its director at the time asserted that what was considered science fiction is now science fact, and that the United States was incapable of defending itself against some of the technologies discovered. Mr. Reed requested for the special designation was denied. Mr. Elizondo, in his resignation letter, October 4th, said that there was a need for more serious attention to many accounts for the Navy and other services of unusual aerial systems interfering with military weapon platforms and displaying beyond next-generation capabilities. He expressed his frustration with the limitations placed on the program, telling Mr. Mattis that there remains a vital need to ascertain capability and intent of these phenomena for the benefit of the armed forces and the nation. Mr. Elizondo has now joined Mr. Putoff and other Defense Department officials, Christopher K. Mellon, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, in a new commercial venture called To the Stars Academy Arts and Science. They are speaking publicly about their efforts as their venture aims to raise money for research into UFOs. The interview, Mr. Elizondo said he and his government colleagues had determined that the phenomenon they had studied did not seem to originate from any country. The fact is not something any government or institution should classify in order to keep secret from the people, he said. For his part, Mr. Reed said he did not know where the objects had come from. If anyone says they have answers now, they are fooling themselves, he said. We do not know. But he said, we have to start someplace. Wow, what an interesting article. I mean, basically, it appears that Tom DeLonge was being truthful. Let's take a look at this video. And what he was saying. And these are some big name guys. So, I mean, this is pretty a big deal. Let's get a look here at this video. Now it seems like it has some kind of like glowing aurora over it, or aura, I mean, like a cloud something, which I've seen in actually one of my UFO encounters. So I know that does in fact happen. The video is really difficult to make out. Basically this is it. You just see a little coffee bean there on the screen. And that's about it. We can't even determine if it's flying, if it's what. It does appear to be at a certain altitude, though. There's still very, very little you get from this video, but still, I mean, this is very exciting. Now, I don't know if that was the craft itself flying away, if this was the from the aircraft moving, but this all appears to be pretty legit. So what are your guys' thoughts on this? I mean, basically they're saying that there was a Men in Black, all right? There was a part in an intelligence agency that investigated UFOs that was funded by black money. What we've been saying this entire time is in fact true. And I think this is incredible. I just want to see what happens to this, because I think this is a big deal. And you know, this kind of proves what we've all been saying for how long, you know? This is no joke. You know, and despite what our genius president has to say, all right, the New York Times is not fake news, all right? So despite what President Trump says, the New York Times is not fake news. These guys are dedicated investigative journalists, and they absolutely do a good job when they go and investigate anything on any story that they publish. So if the New York Times is saying it's legit, then it's fucking legit. There's no argument there. All right, so I don't give a fuck what any fucking stupid Trump supporter says and wants to call this shit fake news. They're fucking idiots. Well, what are your guys' thoughts? All right, do you guys have we been proven correct in this? You guys think that this is all legit? Are these guys all full of shit? You know, what are your guys' thoughts? All right, UFO Proof out. What's up, you guys? UFO Proof here. And have you ever wanted to go and buy UFO hunting equipment but don't know where to get it from? Well, now you're in luck because Amazon has teamed up with UFO Proof in order to bring you everything you need for UFO hunting. And that's why I've opened up the UFO Proof warehouse on Amazon.com. You got cameras, night vision, tripods, everything you need for hunting UFOs is there. Lasers, flashlights, drones, all the equipment you need is in one spot at the UFO Proof warehouse at Amazon.com. Everything you see here on UFO Proof is from Amazon.com. From my microphones, my cameras, everything always comes from Amazon. So that's where you're going to be able to find it, all on UFO Proof warehouse at Amazon.com. The link is in the description below. Just click on it and everything that you see on this show is there for sale at Amazon.com. So make sure you go and pick it up at the UFO Proof warehouse. Link below. Go check it out, you guys. UFO Proof out.